I'm the director of the Urban Food Policy Institute, and we're so pleased to welcome you to the second of our two forums. The last one was in early December about what to expect in Washington, D.C. And so much has happened, right, since that last forum. The image here is the 1963 March on Washington, a really high point of the civil rights movement. And part of the reason I wanted to show this image was to supersede some of the terrible images that we saw on January 6th, and to think about what would it take to begin to see this kind of mobilization for the purposes that brought people together in 1963 in Washington again. We have a very exciting, again, a very exciting group of panelists. I'm going to quickly review the program for this morning, then quickly summarize some of the takeaways from last time, and then turn it over to our speakers. Just give me 1 minute, please. So we have 4 expert, experienced panelists. We're going to hear first in a few minutes from Marlisa Gamblin, who is the Senior Policy Advisor on Racial Equity and Gender Divides at the Bread for World Institute. And I should mention that we have sent around and have in the chat a more extensive biography for each of our speakers, for those of you who want more details. Next, we'll hear from Jackie Vimo, who is the Economic Justice Policy Analyst at the National Immigration Law Center. And you can see in yellow the questions they'll be speaking about when they talk. Our third panelist is Lucy Martinez-Sullivan, who is the Executive Director of Feed the Truth. And finally, we'll hear from Kiana Mickey, who is the founding principal of QJM Multiprise and the former Executive Director of Just Food. After we hear from the 4 panelists, we'll have some time for questions and discussions. We'll ask you to send your questions via chat. We'll open the chat in the discussion period, and we're really so looking forward to hearing your responses and your questions to the panelists. Before turning it back to Marlisa, I wanted to briefly summarize some of the things that were concluded from our last panel in December. And again, we had 4 speakers. The first speaker was Reverend Heber, who spoke, who made a few points that I wanted to remind us of, those of you who were there and for those of you who weren't there, that he encouraged us to use advocacy for the 2023 Farm Bill to create opportunities for Black farmers and landowners to receive federal funds to grow their farms and invest in infrastructure. And we'll hear again today about the connection between Black communities, Black farmers, and achieving higher levels of equity and racial justice in our food system. He also talked about using a variety of federal policies to strengthen the strength-based, asset-based community development. And given his roots in the Black church, which happens to be the largest landowner in Black America, he talked about the importance of using Black churches as a partner in development for food equity. Our next speaker, Josh Kellerman, from Retail Workers Union, talked about some of the important labor initiatives, about establishing an occupational safety and health administration, and we're pleased to see that President Biden has already begun to move that forward. Passing the PRO Act, which protects the rights of workers to organize. Having a union is so important for all workers, but especially for low-wage food workers who have faced enormous difficulties both before the pandemic and during it. And our third panelist was Jim Parrott, who talked about the importance of a stimulus bill that puts money in the pockets of low-wage workers, and especially frontline and essential workers. And again, we've seen at least some progress in Washington in the time since that forum. Jim Parrott also talked about developing coordinated economic and other policies that rebuild a job base for low-income workers. And we talk a lot at our institute about the needs of low-wage food workers and using the COVID pandemic and the emergency, the economic emergency it's created, to build back better a food system where workers have more rights than they did when we started this process. Jim Parrott also talked about creating a national approach to addressing the needs of gig workers and contingent and precarious workers, again, such an essential part of the food workforce and the food system, and really a key to improvements. He talked about providing sufficient federal fiscal relief for state and local governments. And again, we've seen a little bit of progress. The details of that are really important. And here in New York City, we're seeing the huge stresses that the pandemic and the economic collapse has put on state and local government, and their huge challenges in meeting, in responding to the pandemic in effective ways, in food, in public health, in food security, and other areas. And finally, I made some points that I think speak to our larger goal in hosting these two sessions. First, we wanted to use these forums as an opportunity to identify the connections and the common ground between different constituencies, movements working on food, including the food justice movement, the racial justice movement, the climate justice, the environmental justice, economic justice, and to build a shared agenda with food being part of it, where we support these other movements and they support those of us working in food. That's something we hope we'll be able to move to from today's session. And finally, that we can develop a very specific agenda. We all have dozens, perhaps hundreds of goals, but to make progress, we'll need to consolidate a base of power and some specific asks that include both incremental changes and transformative changes. And how do we blend those two together? That's an important question that some of our speakers will be talking about. And with that, I turn it over to Marlisa. Welcome you all, and thank you so much, panelists, for being with us today.
Hi, everyone. So nice being here virtually in our room together. My name is Marlisa Gamblin, Senior Policy Advisor for Racial and Gender Divides at Bread for the World Institute. We're a national hunger organization that focuses on ending hunger both domestically and abroad. I'll be focused more on the domestic piece of it. More specifically, I was charged with the question of what changes are needed to make our food system more equitable and racially just, and more specifically to reduce the racial inequities that we see. So I just want to provide a little bit of background. I'm sure that most of us are familiar with it, so I am not going to go into too much detail. But I think we all at this point understand that a lot of different systems within our country are not racially equitable. That includes, but is not limited to, our food system. We knew this before the pandemic. There were racial divides among communities of color, namely African-American and indigenous populations were around 3 times as likely as our white counterparts to experience food insecurity. We know for our Latino, Latina, as well as our Native Hawaiian brothers and sisters, that rate was about 2 times the amount as it was for their white counterparts. And once we start slicing and dicing the data, disaggregating it in a way that also accounts for gender, we know that women of color had the highest rates, right? But then also when we even go deeper than that, then we see that undocumented immigrants of color also had equally high rates, and returning citizens, people who are returning from incarceration, had even higher, with some studies showing that Black and brown people exiting incarceration had food insecurity rates of 91%. That was about 7 times the amount it was before the pandemic. Then COVID hit. Imagine all the different things I just told you, then COVID. That's what we're dealing with. Unfortunately, although we would like to think in a best case scenario that the divides that I just talked to you about maintained, we actually see that they're widening. Data is constantly being collected and updated and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that we know that the divides are actually widening. So we knew racial equity was important before the pandemic. It's even more important now, okay? That's the state that we are in. If we do not promote racial equity, then our country will literally be worse off before it was in the pandemic. And we weren't doing too well when it came to racial divides even before that. We're doing worse now. This is a pandemic in and of itself. So before I go into the different pieces of what I think is important, right? I think one thing is this proves 2 things. One, we need to apply racial equity lens into food systems, right? And but 2, we need to make sure that we apply a racial equity lens into everything else outside of food systems that impact food systems and that impact a person or a family or community's ability to survive and thrive, essentially fight food insecurity, right? With racial equity, I just want to make sure, because I know that everyone is coming at this from a different level of understanding. When I say racial equity, what I mean is the centering of the experiences, the needs, the leadership, the expertise, and the power of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And doing that in a way that actually results in equal outcomes to where we're eliminating the current racial divides that I spoke about. But we're not only focused on the need. I think that's something that folks tend to think about. We're not only focused on the need, we're also focused on the process for how we do things so that we can finally respect and salute the power that people of color already have and are bringing to the table. So what are the changes? Who's excited? I know I'm excited. It's 9:47, y'all. I'm sure some of you are like, I need my coffee. I don't do coffee because I just have so much energy. So let's get to it, okay? Some of the general things, and y'all can find this in the report that I published in, I think, 2019, applying a racial equity lens into federal nutrition programs, SNAP, WIC, child nutrition, okay? These are some general things, and then I'm gonna go more specifically into SNAP, okay? The first thing is that the design, the implementation, and the evaluation need to center the needs, the leadership, and the power of people of color. Quite frankly, SNAP, WIC, child nutrition, all the other things that we care about, they were not created for us or by us. That's an issue. When we're thinking about reforming these programs that are very much so helpful for us, but in order to reduce the divides that I just talked about, it's important for us to aggressively apply a racial equity lens. Now, to do that, I think it's critically important to make sure that the design, right, of the reforms, that the implementation of who's in charge of implementing those reforms and the evaluation are all centered and led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. That is something that we just historically have not done. This is what justice looks like, okay? Respecting our power and making sure that we actually have veto power in the decision making from the beginning until the end, okay? So that is one of the things that is just kind of a broad sweeping recommendation for all anti-hunger efforts, okay? The second thing is to make sure that all solutions are rooted in historical trauma. Some of you might be like, what's historical trauma, Marlisa? Don't worry, I got you. Historical trauma is essentially the history of racism that people of color have experienced over centuries, okay? Keep in mind that not all communities of color have the same historical trauma because we are all different. we all have different histories and we all have different experiences with white supremacy and racism, okay? It is so critically important that the solutions that we're talking about, when we're thinking about SNAP reform, when we're thinking about WIC reform, when we're thinking about child nutrition reform, that we're always considering and having it be rooted in the historical trauma of government programs as it pertains to serving or not serving Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, as it pertains to why these divides exist in the first place. This is all important for it to be rooted in historical trauma. And the third thing is to make sure that it's not only rooted in historical trauma, but if it's truly rooted in historical trauma, then that means that the solution will be in proportion to the scope of the racial divide. So for example, when we're thinking about COVID, for example, we know that in Michigan, African Americans only represented 20% of the population. However, we represented 40% of folks who contracted and died from the disease. So what does that mean in terms of resource allocation? It means that because we are 2 times as likely to contract and die from the virus as our white counterparts in that particular state, then we need to receive 2 times the support to address the current racial divide that we are talking about. Okay, that's what we are talking about when it's proportionate to. So we're not talking about equal inputs, right? That will not actually address the goal and the definition of racial equity, right? We're trying to eliminate the divide between people of color and their white counterparts. Doing so requires targeted support that's proportionate to the current racial divide. The fourth thing is clear accountability. Our food system programs and policies do not have accountability. We need accountability that, again, is led by people of color, that's responsive to their own communities. And the last thing that I'll mention is racial representation. So making sure that all of the programs, all of the policies that we're talking about are racially representative. Now, when we think about a particular example, right, these are like 5 general things that all food programs need to start adopting now, right? Or yesterday, rather, or maybe even a century ago, okay, y'all? The question is, well, how is this actualized? And I'm gonna give you an example. SNAP. Many of us are familiar with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's proven to be one of the most successful anti-hunger efforts with a ton of different quantitative data and so on and so forth to reduce hunger and poverty. That's great. It can be better. We know that it can be better. It can apply a racial equity lens, which it currently does not. So some of the ways that it can, using some of the principles that I just outlined, include making sure that the supplemental nutrition assistance benefit, right, that goes out each month actually accounts for the racial wealth divide. Guess what, y'all? The racial wealth divide actually increases among the lowest income earners. Who knew that? Not me, until I researched, because guess what? We're usually bought into the idea that equity is the same as racial equity. That's false. That racial equity is very, very particular, right? It's very, very important that we center racial equity. In addition, we're also bought into the idea that class, that poverty is poverty, right? It knows no race, and that we should just focus on that and not race. That's also false. The fact is that poverty is not poverty, it's racialized. And we know that because the racial wealth divide actually increases at its peak among the lowest income earners, AKA those benefiting from SNAP. So a proposal for that would be to actually increase the level of SNAP benefits, additional SNAP benefits for Black and Brown families proportionate to the racial wealth divide that their community experiences. The other recommendation is around caseworkers, y'all. We need our caseworkers and our frontline staff of these programs to actually be representative of our community. That can take on a variety of different things, including tackling the hiring system on who is considered qualified and who's not, okay? Another thing is to be intentional about co-locating services. as a result of structural racism, we are living in areas of racialized concentrated poverty that have food and transit apartheid. This is an issue. In addition to the fact that our time is money, okay? Many of us are working 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So co-locating services, WIC, SNAP, child nutrition, all the stuff so that we don't have to go across, take 2 or 3 buses to qualify for different things. That's important, y'all. That is important. And strengthening the hiring, the training, and the accountability is another thing. There's a lot more things, but guess what? That's what we have my report for, amen? I'm gonna go ahead and link it in, as well as my newest report on COVID-19 and racially equitable responses. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll pass it on to Jackie.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm actually gonna take it back a little bit, and I'm gonna pivot to sort of some of the more historical basis around sort of immigrant exclusions in particular. I'm with the National Immigration Law Center, and we are sort of most known for our work lately in the Supreme Court, fighting the Muslim ban, protecting DACA, and so forth. But one of our big fights over the recent Trump administration has been fighting the public charge rule, which I'll talk about as well. But I wanted to sort of start by saying that I've worked about 25 years, different spaces. New York. I'm also I taught at CUNY for over 10 years, so it's great to be at CUNY. And you know, I've always been the least popular person in the room because I've always worked at the intersection of racial justice, immigrant rights, and workers' rights and anti-poverty issues. And you know, whenever I was dealing with things like walking into a room with anti-poverty and you know, food justice folks, they never wanted to talk about immigration. And whenever I walked into a room with immigrant rights folks, they never wanted me to talk about issues like access to healthcare, food and nutrition programs. And so, you know, I think that the Trump era, for all of its horrors, actually allows us a chance to reset that a little bit. But I'm going to actually take it way back to talk about some of the pre-Trump era features of our anti-poverty and our food and nutrition policies that have gotten us to this situation before I talk about what we can hopefully change under the Biden presidency and the new Congress. So there are two major features of our welfare state and of our food and nutrition policies that really exclude categorically immigrants. One of them is the concept of public charge. Now, public charge is a really old concept. It's over a century old in our immigration law. And the concept of public charge was actually developed in the during the Irish potato famine to exclude Irish immigrants who were fleeing hunger to come to the United States. And there was a real racial panic at that time that the Irish and Catholics were actually a different race. And there's lots of really great writing about how the Irish became white. But the idea was that they were trying to keep out anyone who would be, again, this is from the 1800s, it was in the Immigration Act of 1882, anyone who was an idiot, an insane person, a pauper, or a person likely to become a public charge, a person suffering from a loathsome or dangerous disease, people convicted of felonies, moral turpitude, homosexuals, all these folks were excluded from being able to enter the United States. And central to this idea of public charge, again, is a person who is going to become dependent upon the government. And so this idea of dependency, you know, really has a long history. And it's also just important to know that the targets of those and the racialized character of who was considered to be a burden, a public charge, has changed over time. Again, with the idea of Irish being a different race to today. And you know, central to these ideas are these issues of dependency and deservingness, right? There's a very broad literature about this. Who is deserving of help? And typically those have been white people. Typically, they've been white women and children who are seen as innocent, who are, if they're experiencing hunger or access to, or homelessness or other types of poverty issues, that is because it is through no fault of their own. And I think that we have to just continue to interrogate that and think about how that language of deservingness and dependency continues to permeate our thinking about food policy today. Obviously, in the 1990s under Clinton, with the birth, and prior to that with Reagan, the birth of the welfare queen, you developed a racialized idea of who was dependent, who was a public charge, that was heavily racialized in the figure of African American, in particular African American women with sort of feminized poverty. But again, during '96, I think that often we don't put together, and there are lots of people who are doing great work on this now, but for many years, we often didn't put together the issue of the ways in which native-born Black communities sort of were painted as being dependent and deserving and undeserving, at the same time as immigrant communities were also being portrayed in that way. And that was codified in statute through the '96 welfare reforms. So the '96 welfare reforms, in many of their horrors, also included a lot of the policies that shape our problems today. And what they did was two major things. One is they created the category of qualified and unqualified immigrants. What qualified and unqualified immigrant means is, if you are a qualified immigrant, you are eligible for benefits such as SNAP, such as Medicaid, Section 8 public housing. If you are unqualified, then you are ineligible for those programs. And so that really began to be the era of restrictions around immigration. Prior to that, there had been actually ways that everyone who was here could have access to, safety net programs. And again, when we talk also about public charge back in the 1800s, I think it's really important to remember we didn't have a welfare state then, right? For as miserly as the US welfare state is compared to other welfare systems of similar countries, we were talking about private churches, almshouses that were taking care of people. So I think that's, when we talk about the history of public charge, I think it's also important to remember that. So when we think about the idea of people who are hungry through no fault of their own, I also want to connect that to the conversations around DACA, for example, right? When we talk about DACA and we talk about the innocent children who, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program, the Dreamers, often the language, and that's changed a lot, and it's also changed in the undocumented youth movement, who has really fought against that narrative. But it's what I call the stork theory of migration, right? The idea that these undocumented youth were just dropped from the sky, right? Their parents were the criminals, right? That's the language that gets used. And we're actually seeing that repeated, actually, unfortunately, in some of, even actually in the last few weeks, I've seen that in some of the language of the coverage. And that the fact that their parents come here to work and are completely ineligible for any types of safety net programs because they are unqualified immigrants, because to be qualified, you have to be a citizen. And the other piece is you have to also be here once you even get your green card. So that means you're a lawful permanent resident. You have to wait 5 years in order to be eligible for any programs after you've already been here. So whenever people talk about immigrants coming and, taking benefits and things like that, I mean, it's always just shocking to me that people say that, because actually immigrants are ineligible, even those who are here lawfully present, and even those who have green cards and who are making a life here and who have been here less than 5 years with a green card are not eligible for those programs. And I think that hopefully COVID will give us an opportunity to rethink whether those types of restrictions make sense. And the other kind of big issue that was part of the '96 reforms was this idea from this economist, George Borjas, who talked about welfare magnets. Again, the idea that people come to this country in order to get welfare. Well, fortunately, our programs around food and nutrition and healthcare are actually so lacking that I was recently on a debate on NPR with one of the most famous anti-immigrant leaders in the country. And he admitted to me when I said, you know, I don't understand how you can talk about sort of people coming to this country to get healthcare or, you know, free food or housing. I said, the only reason anyone would come to the country to get those things to the United States is if they were passing by on their way to go to Canada, right? And he actually, you know, agreed with me and said, you're right. You know, like actually the idea that people would come for that is actually laughable given the state of things. But so, you know, again, I think that it's the other piece that's important to note is that immigrants have always been disproportionately employed in our agricultural sector as farm workers and so forth. And so there's this real paradox between the fact that they are producing food and yet are completely cut out from healthcare, you know, and put in such, you know, often dangerous situations working in the fields, sprayed with chemicals. You know, women are often raped in the fields working under really dangerous situations, no food and bathroom breaks, and yet they have no access to safety net programs when they do get sick, providing that food. And again, lots of intersection there with Black sharecroppers who were native born, and a lot of conversations that we need to keep on having about race and the intersection between native born and African-American communities that are Black and other immigrant communities that experience similar related things. And I think that one of the things we've seen in recent years under Trump that we need to do a lot of work to fix is the pitting of native born Black communities against immigrant communities. And there was a real like consistent effort to make it be like immigrants are you know, you haven't even gotten yours yet. You haven't gotten racial justice. Don't let these immigrants come in and get it first. And I think we really need to fight back against that narrative. So, you know, I think one of the other things just to mention, and then I will talk about sort of the Trump and how what we're going to do under the Biden era, is that the 96 laws did allow for state discretion in terms of if you as a state could decide to provide things like healthcare or access to food programs with state-only funds, without federal funds. So that creates like real inequalities and a real patchwork where if you're in California, you have access to, you know, or Washington State, you have access to food and nutrition programs that are state funded. But you cross the border over to Arizona and there's no help, you know, and there's healthcare, for example. You cross the border to Arizona and there's nothing. And so there's a real, you know, inequality across state lines. And that's actually also true of WIC. And people probably won't be too surprised to know that WIC is actually the Women, Infant, and Children program, which provides food and nutrition to pregnant mothers and infants, is actually available to everyone regardless of immigration status in every state except for one. And that is the great state of Indiana under the leadership of Mike Pence, our former vice president, who made the decision to cut out immigrants from that program. Okay, so Trump era. So things were already very bad for immigrants. And it was all, you know, a really, you know, pretty horrible situation, honestly, in terms of healthcare. You know, actually, there were under the Kennedy era, sort of migrant health centers were one of the only places you could actually get healthcare. But for the most part, people were living without healthcare, without access to food and nutrition programs, you know, really atrocious conditions. But two things happened under the Trump era. One is that Trump really leaned into trying to redefine this concept of public charge. And public charge since the 90s, again, I mentioned it, was the idea of someone coming in and being dependent, had been more narrowly defined as anyone who was primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. That was the definition of public charge since the 90s. Now, that meant that the only two things you had to worry about in terms of public charge, and public charge is a test that happens only at 2 points. One is when you enter the United States to get a visa, and two, when you apply for your green card. That's the only time you have to worry about being a public charge. But as long as you didn't accept cash payments, but you weren't eligible for cash payments, because to be eligible for TANF, you have to have had a green card and been here for 5 years, or you were institutionalized long-term under the government's expense, you didn't have to worry. What Trump did was change that. So he redefined public charge to mean anyone who uses one or more public benefits, okay? And again, I wanna note how radical it is to change from a notion of dependency, which we should also interrogate, you know, the idea of what it would mean to be primarily dependent, to also the idea that someone who is using a benefit, because I mean, when we're talking about someone using a benefit being a public charge, many people who use benefits, as I probably don't have to tell people in this room, are using them and working maybe 2 full-time jobs, right? So the fact that being the use of a benefit, I mean, one of the things I learned in this report that I did is, people are getting $9 a month in SNAP, right? And so the idea that alone would make you a public charge is laughable given how paltry our public benefit systems are. So long story short, he redefined public charge to expand it to mean anyone who used a public benefit, and that included Medicaid, that includes SNAP, and that included any type of federal public housing. Now, again, this shouldn't have actually, and it also actually redefined it to anyone who, for example, was very young or very old, anyone who didn't speak English before they even came here. So I always like to say the public charge rule is like a priority setting for someone who happened to have the privilege of being colonized by the British Empire. I'm from Argentina, right? So my colonizers happen to have been Spanish. My family doesn't speak English, but someone else who was colonized by the English suddenly gets a leg up, right? And of course, when Trump said, and Trump's head of USCIS said, when we talk about public charge, we want someone who is Norwegian, let's be very clear about who he means, about who he wants to come into this country. So the public charge rule expanding in that way, and we fought it in the courts, and it's still in the court, and we're waiting on a Supreme Court decision this Friday. What it did was create this environment of fear with people where they were terrified, one, that they thought they were going to be deported because there was really like a lot of confusion about what public charge meant. And so they were like, if we get food stamps, oh my gosh, I'm going to be deported. Or there's also in immigrant communities a lot of misinformation. People think that if your child uses food stamps, that they'll have to enter the military and been sent overseas to fight, that they'll be that the child will be taken away from you, that the child will have their wages garnished after they turn 18 if they ever use food stamps or healthcare. The fears and the terrors are tremendous. And there's a link in the report, and I've gone on and on and on, and I've taken a little too much time, but to say that one of the things we found, so I spent not this year, the year before, traveling around the country doing interviews with mixed status families. So families where some people were immigrants and some people were US citizens, because very often 1 in 4 children in the United States has a foreign born parent. So what we're talking about is there's no way to actually talk about immigration without also talking about US citizens, right? You can't separate, folks from each other. So all the Trump attacks that hit immigrants also hit US citizens. But so the public charge sort of piece, what we found is, that people that were part of our study, 80% of them had expressed terror and fear over accessing, types of food assistance. And 80% of them worried that they would run out of food before they got money to buy more in the last 12 months. And so they were, by the definition that researchers use, food insecure. And that ultimately they were more likely to apply for healthcare or Medicaid for their US citizen children than they were for SNAP. And what they said was that they were worried that if they accessed these programs, that they would be deported and their families would be torn apart, or they would lose their children. And so, I think that it's really important to see, that was even the research started prior to the COVID pandemic. Since the COVID pandemic, and again, we've known that there's been disproportionate impact, particularly on Black and Latinx communities. We've also seen that household food insecurity in 2020, while for white people has hovered, under 20%, has been in the, over 30% for Black and Latinx communities. And so this is a real crisis. All that to say is our major priorities right now, and I'll talk about this more later, is one, we have to get rid of this public charge rule. We're waiting on the Biden administration to make an announcement, potentially about immigration tomorrow, or early next week. We hope that he will rescind the public charge rule that expanded it to say anyone is a public charge if they use a public benefit. The other thing we're looking for, and the Supreme Court is also potentially going to rule on this tomorrow, so we're waiting. And I think the other piece is we have to ensure that immigrants are included in the stimulus packages, right? That we have to recognize that none of us can recover if everyone isn't included in COVID relief. And so, I think we have a lot of work to do to undo the harm of the Trump era. We have to make sure that immigrants no longer are excluded because they've been excluded from the previous packages because you had to have a social security number in order to receive the stimulus check. And we need to rebuild trust, right? Because people are terrified of government right now. And also we need to be more visionary, and I'll talk about this when we come back. We need to fix the 96 exclusions that were pre-Trump. We need to take a visionary approach to how we're going to fight poverty, and that includes everything from minimum wage to union protections, protections for farm workers, you know, and eliminate all those exclusions that have existed for many years that bar immigrants from accessing programs they need to keep their families healthy and strong. So with that, I've gone on too long. I will pass it over to Lucy. I'm sorry for taking too much time.
Thanks so much, Jackie. That was absolutely brilliant. And thanks for all the great work that you and your colleagues are doing on this front. I'm Lucy Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of Feed the Truth. Feed the Truth is a new organization that was started to promote greater transparency in the food system and fight for a fairer, more equitable food system, mainly by disrupting big food's control over our health and our democracy. So we've been talking a lot about the massive inequities that we see that are produced by the food systems and disproportionate impacts, and how Black and Latinos, and Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by obesity, food insecurity, diet-related disease, even COVID, with Blacks dying at 2 times the rate from COVID as whites. We talk about disproportionate impacts, but I think we don't necessarily talk about disproportionate power enough, or how specifically the disproportionate power that industry has creates a lot of the disproportionate impacts that we see. And so when we talk about federal policy recommendations and a new policy and legislative agenda for the Biden administration, I think it's important that we ground ourselves on where power currently resides in Washington. And it's not in the hands of lawmakers or cabinet secretaries or civil servants. Quite frankly, it's in the hands of lobbyists from food companies, trade associations, and so-called revolvers. So people that come into government from the food industry and come out of government to go lobby for powerful trade groups and the so-called industry stakeholders. And so these are the power brokers that shape the legislative agenda. They work behind the scenes to kill regulations, to create a more favorable regulatory environment, and actually oppose progressive policy ideas like a national tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, or regulations on junk food marketing to kids, or front-of-pack warning labels for sugar, salt, and saturated fats, things that we know will go a long way in improving public health and reducing the racial and ethnic disparities in health. So why haven't we been able to get more traction on these sorts of things, on stronger standards, for sugar in school meals, or addressing farm subsidies or crop insurance to incentivize the production of fruits and vegetables away from the production of corn and soy, which are the building blocks of ultra-processed foods? And the reason is really simple. It's powerful industry opposition, and these vested interests, they work hard to ensure a favorable business-friendly regulatory climate and block progress. And this is true regardless of who's in power, right? This is a Republican problem, a Democratic problem. It has existed, from time immemorial. And so because big food has so much clout in Washington, industry opposition really does have a real chilling effect on political will. Weakening the political will to enact any kind of common sense reforms or any of the policies that many of us in this community talk about. And big food also promotes these narratives around consumer freedom, consumer choice, invoking the nanny state, talking about individual responsibility, and shifting the blame for poor nutrition back on us. And in that way, the big food sort of drives this lack of demand, public demand for change. So I think to change federal food policy in ways that will actually reverse the epidemics of obesity and diet-related disease, which, again, conditions disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities, we actually need to break the stranglehold that industry has on our government and our democratically elected leaders. The reality is business as usual in Washington has gotten us to where we are today. It's gotten us to a food system that's designed to maximize profit at the expense of people's health, worker safety, and our children's future on this planet. And it maximizes profit at the greatest expense of Black and brown people and undocumented people, as Jackie was just alluding to, in terms of how many undocumented people work and carry the brunt of the food system, of producing food in this country and preparing food in this country. So I would say that as a food policy community, we have to realize that advancing our agenda, particularly in this administration, to a healthier, creating a healthier, more equitable food system is actually dependent on changing this business as usual approach to policymaking and legislating. And to me, this means that we have to think about our food policy agenda a little bit more expansively, to include efforts to rein in the power of big food and actually tackle food industry consolidation, to champion campaign finance reform, anti-corruption measures, and actually to change some of the economic incentives that have perpetuated these disparities and have deepened the inequities in health outcomes. And I'll talk about what that means specifically. It's important that we understand that the source of the food industry's massive political power here in Washington, D.C. is their economic power. And the food industry's economic power has grown significantly in the past 40 years as a result of massive deregulation and aggressive consolidation. So big companies getting bigger through mergers and acquisitions, gobbling up smaller companies. And the food industry has become so consolidated that fewer than 30 companies in the US control 50 to 80% of various segments in the food system. 3 companies are responsible for buying or selling almost every chicken in America. 3 companies own over 80% of the cereal market. 4 companies produce 85% of the beef in the US, and 4 companies control 80% of the soft drink market. So when we look at these numbers in terms of how few companies are really in charge of our food system, it's really easy to see who's calling the shots when it comes to our ag and food policy. Just last year, we saw a glaring example of how the ag and food monopolies call the shots on policy. The North American Meat Institute essentially drafted Trump's executive order that kept meat packing plants running at full capacity despite the COVID outbreaks. And research has shown now that these large meat processing facilities and these large meat packing plants are COVID transmission vectors, and that those plants that received permission from USDA to increase their production line speed saw more countywide cases of COVID. And so this, to me, is an example of just how a couple of powerful companies work together to lobby the government to protect their bottom lines at the expense of public health and at the expense of the Black and brown and immigrant workers that work those lines at these facilities. So highly consolidated industries are problematic in a number of different ways. They become too big to regulate. They set the market terms, the prices. They squeeze out ranchers and farmers and workers, paying them as little as possible for their labor. It's interesting, Marlisa mentioned historical trauma, and I want to acknowledge here that food industry consolidation, the consolidation we see today, is actually very much rooted in historical trauma. Following the Great Depression, there was a highly racialized agricultural land consolidation and a massive transfer of land and wealth from the hands of Black farmers into the hands of white farmers through a series of policy decisions and actions. So this has a lot of implications, of course, for equity. And breaking the back of industry's political power so that we are more able as a community to put in place the kinds of food, nutrition, environmental, and labor reforms that will save lives and improve lives means breaking up these food monopolies, particularly the monopolies in chicken and hog and beef processing and seeds, and breaking up these monopolies and addressing this food industry consolidation can be addressed through the Farm Bill, actually, in a variety of ways, including capping subsidy payments to large corporate farms and expanding loan programs to support underserved farmers and ranchers, particularly Black farmers and ranchers. Another way to limit the political power of the food industry and give sort of progressive food policy ideas a fighting chance is to push for campaign finance reform and stop the revolving door between big food and government and have greater transparency in corporate lobbying. Excuse me. At the top of this list, of course, is advocating for a reversal of the Supreme Court Citizen United decision, which held that unlimited spending by corporations and other outside groups on elections was protected as free speech. So Citizens United, as you all know, opened the floodgates of money And it meant that our political system, our democratic system, would predominantly serve those who can afford to buy the influence. It's really interesting. In a recent op-ed, Paul Pullman, who's the former chief executive officer of Unilever, actually called on companies, on other CEOs, to start pushing for an end to Citizens United. And he said, that decision brought the US political system to the point of legalized corruption. Pullman also, as the former CEO of one of the largest food companies, also called for companies to end trade association and corporate lobbying, and for companies to end corporate campaign contributions and dissolve their corporate PACs. So it was a pretty bold call. In terms of policy reform, so right now in the House, Democrats are advancing HR 1, the For the People Act. It's an ambitious package of anti-corruption and election reform measures, which, among other things, aims to end the dominance of corporate money influence peddling, and it reveals who's funding dark money groups, online political ads, and interestingly, requiring publicly traded companies to actually consult with shareholders before spending on politics. Notwithstanding the fact that President Biden nominated the dairy industry's top lobbyist to serve as Secretary of Agriculture, the executive order that he signed last week is a good start to dealing with this revolving door problem between big food and government. It aims to prevent his administration officials from lobbying shortly after they leave the executive branch. And it is stronger and more comprehensive than previous bans, which have failed actually to really be properly enforced. So this is the key, actually enforcing this vigorous enforcement of these bans is absolutely critical. And I would say finally, shifting the food system so that it supports health rather than destroys the health of people and planet, and so it works for everybody, requires that we shift the underlying economic incentives in the system. And so to put it simply, we have to incentivize the good and de-incentivize the bad. And the instruments here are taxes and subsidies. So one of the things that has not, I don't think, had enough of a conversation or attention, and hopefully will in this administration and in this Congress, is a national tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. This has to be on the table now, particularly as the demand for greater investment in public health and greater investment in expanding SNAP has grown, right? There's such a huge need. So raising revenue for the government is going to be incredibly important. And the revenue that's raised by potentially a national tax on sodas or even other junk food can fund many of the programs that can tackle food insecurities and help address the health inequities that Black, Latinos, and Indigenous people face. A national sugar-sweetened beverage tax can also help offset a national investment that we need in a fruit and vegetable subsidy program. So research has shown that such a program, the fruit and vegetable subsidy program, can improve diets, can reduce heart disease, reduce disparities, reduce food insecurities, and all the while supporting farmers and retailers. And through the 2018 Farm Bill, actually, the federal government dedicated about $56 million over 5 years to the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program, or GusNIP, which provides incentives to participants in SNAP to purchase fruits and vegetables. And so the Biden administration has an opportunity to dramatically expand this program so that it serves more people. I would say after the darkness and corruption and fear, I think that many of us experienced over the last 4 years, I hope that those of us that work in this space, that work on food and health and ag policy and immigration policy, can also see ourselves sort of working toward a new era of food democracy. So I'd encourage us to think about how we join forces with organizations and organizers, as well as those in the labor movement, who are working to tackle money in politics and break up monopolies and really rein in the power of big industry conglomerates and other sectors. So I will leave it there, and I'm going to turn it over to Kiana McKee as our last speaker. Over to you, Kiana.
Good. Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited. Definitely a hard act to follow with you ladies and folks. I feel like what I hope people are hearing and seeing is how so much of our work is intersectional, how much of the inequity is great, and the diverse ways that we need to approach this in order to dismantle these mechanisms, these systems, these policies, and really work together in solidarity to move. So we all bring unique strengths. There's opportunities to kind of, leverage collective power. And that's just something that I'm hoping to amplify, but I think everybody thus far has really laid that groundwork. And so what I really like is that this is a conversation that we're talking about, looking ahead or federal policy, but what you're hearing doesn't just reach federal policy, which can be slow moving, but it also starts to talk about, and we're also unpacking how it's impacting us on our daily, daily lives, our livelihood, the livelihood of our community, the resiliency that we see in our community, the folks that are in us, and how we need to not reknit an old system, but really build towards new. So these are just things I'm going to try to amplify. I hope I do justice. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to just roll, and then I guess y'all will bring Sandman out if you need to. But my questions, what I was charged with was thinking about roles, but before I can really jump into roles, I wanted to, say that I think we needed to acknowledge that our food and farm policy has been built and continues to perpetuate. It's built on stolen land, exploited labor, and extractive agriculture, economic practices, as well as extractive agriculture practices. And these are inequities that are intersectional and still persist. And they're evident in how they impact our communities, in particular, historically and economically marginalized communities, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities in particular. And we also see this evidence because we're living in it. We're living in this intersecting crises of climate, of health, of food, of economy. And there's no evidence there. We continue to, if we're living in it, we can't continue to do this. As we've seen, this will be the way that we end. This is not the way forward. This is not the way that we should be trying to get back to normal. So oftentimes I think people have said that, not here, but in terms of I want to go back to normal. I need policy to go back to the way it was. I don't see that as the way because it's been so rooted in inequity. And, when we talk about roles, or we talk about how to change policy, then we need to, in order to change policy, we need the power to change. We need the most impacted need to have the power to be the most activated, to become in all aspects of our food system. We can't no longer just be subjected to roles of perpetual recipients, or like Jackie mentioned, who deserves and who's dependent. What we really need is to become those drivers of change, to become those policymakers, to become land stewards and practitioners of regenerative agriculture and economies. And not in these very small ways, but this should be the bedrock of our policy. These should be the folks that are the leaders of our policy and work. So to answer the question of roles, I think it also is not just looking at different titles or things that we can do on the ground, but it's really kind of looking at it, and sometimes I kind of phrase it as the infiltration of existing systems, and how we all can do that, whether we're individuals and how we galvanize together or groups, but also are we building alternative systems of economy that are, built, rooted in solidarity, rooted in economic, climate, and social justice, that is going to support reciprocity and the equitable dissemination of wealth and resources in our natural, our social, our political, and built environments. We can no longer really just talk about food policy as just food. What we really see is it impacts all of our parts of our life. And so when thinking about building alternative systems, sometimes people feel like you have to wait for the Shangri-La to happen. And that's not true. What we're seeing and what we're doing is building alternative initiatives, work, progress now, leveraging existing capital and resources in this capitalist system to build what we want to see then. It's not a light switch off where then today is capitalism, tomorrow it's something else. There's genuine bridges that need to be changed in policy, genuine bridges of the work that we do now that needs to be resourced to really see in motion the things that we talk about in terms of racial equity, environmental equity, and economic equity. So when thinking about systems, I get very inspired by the solidarity economy models and moving towards a just transition, in systems. And I see that grassroots groups here can continue to leverage our collective power to galvanize individuals to shift federal policy as well as other policy from local on up. And to be clear, what I'm trying to talk about and what I'm trying to amplify is what other folks have lifted up too, which is resiliency, not extractive, not exploitative measures, not on the burden out of the backs of Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, but real resiliency from the ground up. And I hope that what people are seeing with the insurrection, with the inequities, with the exacerbation of like COVID, is that what we've been told for so long is that our policies have been working and there was just these modest gaps, or that capitalism was doing it for us, or our food system was like totally safe and fine. And we see that it hasn't, and it wouldn't be. So why we have been so conditioned to think corporate control ag and that power was going to feed us, what we saw in the midst of a crisis, that it was fragile and it broke. And what was really there for us was our local and regional value chains, our local and regional community leaders and advocates who were nimble enough to figure out ways to pivot, how to work with each other to meet the folks that were the most impacted when we were all impacted. And so I hope that this is some of the things that people are seeing. And while mutualism is a part of the solidarity economy, I also want to be clear that I'm not referencing band-aids that are deployed are deployed and exploit communities of color in order to find places to dump surplus food and a way to have an excuse for food waste, and to only see it and then take away our dignity of our food, our dignity of our choice, our dignity of our power, and the dignity of growing good food. And then just saying like, that's just food, you need it, take it, because those lines will continue to happen. Though, oftentimes, even the work that I've done, even some of the immediate response work, I don't feel good going back, seeing those partners, trying to meet an immediate response, knowing that those seniors, knowing that those families are going to have to be there that next week. There's nothing beautiful in charity, to be honest. So sorry, take that for what you will. But I want us to really push around dismissifying what's immediate response and what's emergent response, and what will really be here, not just for the short term, but how do we support solidarity-based work that's really around resiliency and viability. So in the other role, when I talk about infiltration of existing resources, existing systems, I think that's a good opportunity to talk about federal policy and how to engage. So it's not just voting, it's not just in elected offices, but it's really seeing the power that we have together to leverage the change that we need to see in systemic policy. And that change is not going to happen waiting for them. And it's not going to happen just by continuing to do what we did. So when I, lift up the key lessons or connecting to that, I think what we've seen in our activism and what we should continue to push is that there's a nimbleness and a resiliency in our models that are rooted in solidarity, that support farm viability and not just expect farmers to donate, that support fair wages and don't expect people to just accept anything or be invisible in their work or be harmed and while they're trying to do their work, but really building long-term and resourcing long-term food access models and value chains like CSAs, like farmers markets, like direct to farmer and producer, that really speak to building the relationships that will keep us whole in the immediate as well as the long term. The other thing that I've seen that is a key lesson is that we shouldn't have data be used and to justify supporting donation reliant or charity based emergency efforts. Because as Mary Lisa, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I misspoke your name, mentioned, is that what we're seeing is even with trillions of dollars put into those models, even in a time of immediate and stark crisis, we still have food insecurity that is increasing. So we're not going to you're not going to dismantle food insecurity by supporting models that perpetrate that model. What you need to do is support food justice and food sovereignty models that are built with the expectation that the most impacted are the policymakers, are the drivers of the aggregation reform, and are the leaders of our commerce in times in our community, and that we're not extracting from the land, but we're trying to build regenerative ways to keep us thriving. Good examples of that, I feel like, in leveraging like federal dollars is my partners in Tulani Lake Enterprises in the Navajo Nation, where they leveraged $3.46 million from the CARES Act to build water infrastructure and hoop house infrastructure, as well as creating jobs. So, I think a lot of times we've seen so many things around emergency food and emergency boxes and free fridges. And again, I think those are immediate, but if we're talking long-term, we're talking infrastructure. If we're talking long-term, we're talking about bringing the rights to water, to land, to food access long-term, and the ways that those folks want to grow. So those are things that I want to see, not just in Navajo Nation, but that we should be seeing nationally, and we should be seeing in our neighborhoods, and we should feel like that's the policy that we're seeing from the local to the federal level. And again, there's this difference between the difference between consolidation and solidarity efforts, even within folks of Black, and BIPOC communities, and that we're not a monolith, and that we need to push through performative funding. We need to push through performative tokenizing of leaders and groups that are going to fund just the top of their work, and those resources will never get to the most impacted. What we really need to do is push all of ourselves to really challenge what are being lifted as solidarity-based models that are going to impact the most Black and brown folks, to see, is it really built with the mechanisms, the tools, and connections to policy that's going to have equitable dissemination of wealth and land among the most impacted, not just the top 3 folks that you know and see all the time. We need those folks, we need other folks that are already doing that work to be resourced. And we need to make sure we have policies that do not support just the biggest players, but actually support the work that's happening on the ground, and do not divert their attention from their food justice and food sovereignty work in order to meet emergency resources and needs and policies. I think we don't have time for questions, so I just wanted to squeeze this in, is that because people, federal policy can take so long. Even Jackie was mentioning something, around like public charges just even coming up today, and we're in like a totally different administration, is that the grassroots can leverage platforms of our collective work, like, for instance, like the HEAL platform, like the platform of urgency, like the FAO platform of sustainable development goals. These are ways that we can find ways to galvanize and connect to each other, to amplify the work that we do respectively, but to build collective power, and use these as the tools to shift the policies that are impacting our food and our daily life. And I wanted to leave on that in terms of how to connect the local to the federal. We don't have to feel like it's overwhelming. We don't have to feel like it's something that never changes. But in fact, I think these are the times where we have to say, we just have to change it differently, and we need the policy to work for us. And the first stop is us being the people making the policies.
Kiana, Lucy, Jackie, Marlisa, each of your talks was a gift that I think was so meaningful. But I think together you've provided a comprehensive, detailed, and inspiring path to a different way of doing food policy, and a different expanded notion of what food justice might mean. While we're waiting for questions to pour in from all of you participants, and thank you so much for sticking with us, I wanted to ask a very big question and ask each of you to maybe say 1 or 2 sentences about this topic, which perhaps should be a topic of a future forum. Each of you talked some about intersectionality and the different roles people have. And I wonder if each of you could say just a little of how you think about the intersection of racial and immigrant justice and addressing inequities, and gender inequities and addressing those. How do they fit together? How are you thinking about addressing that intersectionality in your work? And again, brief so we have time for questions.
Yeah.
Marlisa, do you want to start?
Yeah,
With that little question.
Hey everyone, again, I'll say this. Intersectionality is so important to look at. For folks who don't know Bell Hooks, look her up, look her work up. For folks who don't know Kimberly Crenshaw, look her work up. She's amazing. In many ways, I, as well as other people in general, stand on their shoulders. And it is so critically important. When I was sharing just the different levels of food insecurity, for example, right? This is just one example. Then we saw that when we looked at different pieces of intersections of one's identity, that actually increased, right? Contingent on that particular identity being close to power or not, right? Actually can increase someone's susceptibility to experiencing food insecurity and so on and so forth, right? That's, again, just one example. There's a lot of other examples, okay? Now, I think when it comes to like the intersection of race and immigration, like you asked, Nick, I think it's so critically important to go back to the construction of race with almost anything, and understand that the construction of race was really built out of the antithesis of whiteness, which is Blackness. And when we're thinking about it like that, then it becomes easy to understand the construction then of other things, including but not limited to our understanding of immigration, as well as the lived experience of many undocumented immigrants in this country today, and how heavily tied it is to a narrative and a history of anti-Blackness. I think that's critical, right? I think when we're thinking about the intersection of race and gender, for example, I think, again, it's so important to center Blackness within that, because women of color, we normally have to choose between being a person of color versus being a woman. And as a result of white supremacy dominating feminism and womanhood and gender equity and all of those other things, we're essentially silenced. And what does that do? We are, as a result, more susceptible to experiencing some of the most egregious things in society. And guess what? When you mix all 3 of those things together, like Jackie said, then you unfortunately have undocumented women of color who are experiencing things like rape in the workforce, right? And think about the lineage of that, right? Who else experienced rape in the workforce? Black women when we were enslaved. So it's so critically important that we go back to the historical trauma as it relates to intersectionality, and we don't forget that.
Thanks. Other comments, short, and we have a few more big questions coming right up.
Yeah, I just would love to piggyback in the sense of, yeah, I mean, I think intersectionality is important, but yes, we live in a very complex environment and environments. And so I think holding nuance as well as holding like how intersectionality can impact really then starts to demonstrate how important like equitable dissemination versus equality, or siloing our power or work, speaks to how then we're actually perpetrating, impacting people disproportionately. So I really appreciate you continuing to like amplify and bring that up. my few words, I think, really kind of land just to echo, what we've lifted thus far is like comprehensive, economic stimulus bills that provide equitable resources to regional value chains, folks, small, mid-scale farmers, sustainable farmers, environmental stewards of our broader lands, fisher folk, making sure that we're taking care of our water as well as like our land and our soil, equitable labor practices and wages and healthcare around workers from field to restaurants and consumers. And I think we always tend to just look at just end consumers, but really seeing how important this chain is in needing federal dollars, needing state dollars, needing local dollars and policy to really support those resilient chains that typically get marginalized or under-resourced, to really start getting adequate and equitable resources for us to really be able to scale. Because I do think when we start scaling resources and we start acknowledging scale in contracts, we will also start addressing some of these disproportionate inequities that we continue to see in our work. And then people don't use that as a barrier to say like, well, we can't just focus on Black farmers, we need to do these other things. But it's like the majority of Black farmers are also small to mid scale. So let's actually, push back on some of the policies, push back on some of the language, and kind of like Lucy was saying as well, is like pushing back on some of the disproportionate power that lobbyists hold in our systems. So economic, bills that really speak to the most impacted in a practical, pragmatic way to get equitable distribution of capital, land, and wealth. I think also infrastructure and land tenure. We're not going to be able to do this work without the power of aggregation when we're talking about the most impacted. So it's not just dumping a bunch of money in one policy. Say, for instance, like when the most recent urban ag federal dollars were disseminated, there was no lens to scale. There was no lens to even race, really. So what you had was community gardeners doing proven work in their land, going against trying to get federal dollars with municipalities. That's just that kind of inequity of power and resources and capital is just too hard to bear. And that's just not realistic. And so when we think about urban ag, and I think we need to see scale in all of our work, but even thinking about New York City in particular, in urban ag work, we need to continue to push, not just for funding for trainings. We have training programs already. They get well funded from the federal level to the local level. But what we need to see is is policy going to change where we're improving the connection between local and state policies that get in the way of enterprise on urban land. And that needs to include not just private land, but it needs to also include land that's under city purview. And if we don't continue to address that and get out of that vagueness, those will be the ways that people are marginalized when they try to figure out ways to build models of enterprise and production on urban land. We need to continue to push our policy to not just think of loans or micro loans to folks, but really finding ways to talk about land tenure and being okay with that and seeing that land tenure might overlap with land use, but it also connects to food and farm policy. And if we truly want to do things beyond these pastoral images of rural farmers and urban farmers, that we need land tenure in our urban lands. And we need practical policies that support that. We need to go beyond lease agreements of city-owned land, and we need to start pushing ourselves to leverage the precedents of community land trusts and collective tenure and ownership with the expectation or the support of like genuine infrastructure around growing. I'd be remiss to not think about or mention Miss Brenda of Lady Isabella, because she gives such a great example of that. And when we talk about infrastructure, I talked about large infrastructure with Talani Lake and Navajo Nation with water, but Miss Brenda talks about, infrastructure for hoop houses, Yeah, not hoop houses, because those are not permanent. Greenhouses. So we're supporting policies that support infrastructure on urban land that will help them connect to electricity and extend the growing season, so we can actually have the food access we talk about, the land tenure that we say. It needs to be there from the hyperlocal to the federal level policy.
Jackie and Lucy, I'm going to put another question on the table. I forgive you and forgive me for moving on. And I think we're going to be together for about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we're going to leave the chat open for another 30 minutes or so that if any of you want to direct a question at one of the panelists, if they can stay, we can have a more unmoderated discussion. And if I can ask those of you to be more tweet length in your responses, so we can just get some things on the question on the table. N. Brady asks us, what do we think about the connections between, or the intersection between, conventional agriculture and community-based agriculture, and maybe throwing in there, what's the place for agroecology, and how do we address climate change? And maybe if each of you have just a sentence or two around federal policy, where do we go in finding the transitions and finding the intersections around those issues? Jackie or Lucy, do you want to start on that?
I think it's a great question, actually, and just in referring back to the massive consolidation that we have in the food system in the hands of just a few powerful companies and conglomerates. We really need to start thinking about policies that support regional food systems, and we've seen with COVID, it was such a shock to all the systems, including the food system. And I think the notion of building a more resilient food system also has equity impacts when we think about investing. Small, medium sized enterprises and smaller production, smallholder farmers, and again, regional food system. And so I know there's a lot of work happening in that area right now, and a lot of interest happening in that area. And I think I'm excited to see sort of what policy ideas, and I don't know if other colleagues can. Marlisa, if this is more up your alley in terms of specific federal policies that can help promote those kinds of investments in regional food systems.
Yeah, I would say it's actually not up my alley for regional, but well, to a certain extent. I will say this really, really short, that in the paper that Rosita out there like earlier in the chat, I would say in terms of like regional stuff, the only thing that really came out of my work like with community was the desire to not only grow our own food, but also to distribute that, because it gets, to be able to actually grow and then distribute, and the need for, again, not loans, we don't need that, but like actual capital that I would say we don't have to pay back because we built this country, actual capital that we can then kind of like build the infrastructure, exactly like what Kiana was saying, the infrastructure, because that takes infrastructure. So I would say doing that, making sure it's community specific on the community level for the regional piece. But outside of that, that's all that that I've been hearing kind of from community.
So I'm going to ask a last question and then open it up for the unmoderated chat that some of you might want to direct a particular question at one of our speakers. And first, let me thank each of our panelists, thank also Rosita and the staff of the Urban Food Policy Institute, and all of you for your ardent participation in this discussion. Abby Foote asks about what is actually possible in this Biden administration over the next few years. What are the opportunity and the constraints of federal policy change? And I'd like to ask you to comment briefly on that in light of some of the things you talked about. What would be your 2-3 recommendations for policy priorities in the area you talked about that you think progress is possible in the next 4 years in this administration? And maybe we'll go in the order I'm seeing people on my screen, which is Jackie, Kiana, Lucy, and Marlisa. Jackie?
This is a great question around the possibility. I was in a conversation with a state advocate, anti-hunger advocate yesterday, and he said to me, you know, there's a real problem with the DC anti-hunger advocates because they have a real narrow view of what's politically possible. And he really called me out, and it was just, you know, I think that the idea that we only have 60 votes and that we have an even more narrow majority is making a lot of people have very small visions for the future. I think, you know, so I would just say that one, to answer sort of like a lot of these questions, that I think that the issue of essential workers both is a really helpful and a not helpful frame for thinking through some of our sort of what's possible. I think that we do have a very narrow window of opportunity because of COVID-19 to like say, you know, that emergencies do create new windows of opportunity. I think the question of who is essential, what is essential, you know, and the idea also of the ways in which who's at the front lines, right? Black, BIPOC communities, Black workers, immigrants, you know, are the ones who we're delivering the food, we're in the fields, we're in the, you know, food processing facilities. And yet at the same time, you know, when we talk about front lines, this is a war metaphor. We're talking about cannon fodder, right? We're talking about the risk that people, you know, were put in. And I think that not only that, but also from a gender lens, the invisibilization, as we'll call it, right, of non-remunerated care, right? Women staying home often and taking care of family members who get sick from COVID, doing the cooking, you know, domestic labor that's unpaid. So I think that like there's a really interesting window of what is essential, like food, water, labor, you know, that both renders visible some of these dynamics. And I love the work that Lucy's doing to sort of bring sort of the economics to the center of it. But, you know, so the top 3 things are, you know, everyone needs to be included in COVID stimulus. None of us can recover if everyone is not included. We need to undo the harm of the Trump administration. That includes rolling back all the horrible administrative rulemaking, public charge, getting rid of the new tax cuts and jobs act that was a huge giveaway to the wealthy and imposed a new Social Security number on a requirement on the child tax credit. But removing barriers, but also thinking beyond, right? So I think that, you know, I think that there's like small things we can do, like community eligibility for school meals programs, which is great because it removes the, you know, I think if school meals, people don't have to apply, it's going to be a lot easier. And I think that kind of model is really important, but that's still a very narrow reformist policy, right? One of the things I can tell you is that in Biden's immigration plan, he doesn't include access to food, nutrition, and healthcare, sort of from what we've heard in the early drafts of the plan, right? This is the old model, right? You know, we're not talking about fixing welfare, and you know, there was the ABOD rule and all these other sort of snap changes. We need to radically fix 96. We need to radically fix our immigration system, and we're not talking about the sort of going back and making little tweaks. We need to sort of start from the beginning. And for me, you know, unless we have that kind of vision, we are going to be back where we started. And yeah, and I think that the question is, what is essential? Who is essential? And how do we decide that is an interesting lens. So I will stop there.
Kiana?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to just, I guess, amplify and just, you know, again, like, I really think it's around, you know, solidarity economies that really speak to equitable dissemination of wealth and resources and capital. It's around land tenure of urban and rural lands to Black and Brown Indigenous folks. It's it's regenerative agriculture. Like we need to stop thinking of it as being patchwork to move forward and really thinking, like Jackie was saying, how to really undo and dismantle. So it's really supporting, in short, a just transition to regenerative practices and economies that the most impacted become the most active. And that's across the board of, all food, farm policies and the intersection of immigration as well, in my opinion.
Lucy?
So I'll try to be quick. I would say, just to echo what Jackie mentioned, I think the ambition, the scale of the ambition, we have to be ambitious. And this is the time. This is the time in a crisis. Let's not waste this crisis around COVID. I would say raise the minimum wage. I think putting more money in the hands of people will go a long way, actually, to help tackle food insecurity and enable people to buy healthier foods and get healthier diets in place. No big deal, but overturn Citizens United, which will take a constitutional amendment. That it's important that we constrain the power of industry, because we have to regulate. We have to regulate these industries much more heavily to protect workers, to protect our environment, to protect our health. And I think a key mechanism to do that is, of course, again, constrain their power. And then I would say finally, universal school meals. So why aren't we, as a country, thinking about how we feed every single child that goes to school and ensure that they have, healthy, nutritious food at least once or possibly twice a day. So the time is now to push for that. It's the right thing to do. And just one quick point on the intersectionality, since I didn't get to answer that. The way that we approach it through our work is actually taking a human rights perspective. And I don't think we talk about that concept enough in this country. So every human being has the right to health. Every human being has the right to healthy food. And I'd say that the concept around universal school meal. Every child has a right to eat healthy food. Thanks. And I guess Marlisa, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just want to say I second everything that everyone just said. Okay. And since I'm the last one, I have the power to, I guess, second and and co-sign on all of those. I think that the biggest overarching thing that I would say is moving forward, and in lockstep with a lot of what y'all said, it's so critically important to apply a racial equity lens to everything. People of color experience all the different intersections we just talked about. So if you apply racial equity and that's at the center, then you're forced to look at immigration policy. You're forced to look at gender equity. You're forced to look at class equity. You're forced to look at food justice. You're forced to look at all of these different intersections, because guess what? People of color are affected by all of it. So let's center racial equity. I just actually put in the chat a scorecard that I designed to help policymakers and even help us rate policies, right? If we're thinking about really, really cool solutions, guess what? Let's use that scorecard to figure out like what that process should be, so that people of color, Black and Brown and Indigenous people, we can be centered from the beginning, the inception of the idea, to the design, to the implementation, to the evaluation. That our research, that our expertise, all of that, lived experience expertise, scholarly expertise, everything in between, that all of that is respected and centered in the design of the policy, and that we're making sure that everything is rooted in historical trauma and proportionate to. The other thing that I want to say is, yes, COVID-19 responses need to be racially equitable. Please read my report that's in there. It actually talks the importance about centering Black women. It forces us to look at the intersection, okay, y'all? That is important. The other thing that I will say is on the stimulus checks, we should not have universal stimulus checks. I'm just going to say that. Everyone does not need the stimulus checks. The second thing is that, yes, while it should be on class, we should also apply a racial equity lens to that, which means that Black and Brown communities will receive an additional amount relative to their white counterparts in the same income class because they experience the racial wealth divide. Hello, we need that. That is the same with SNAP. That is the same with, hey, I'm going to say it, minimum wage. Let's rethink what we think about when we say apply racial equity lens at a minimum wage, because minimum wage, the way that we're thinking about it, is only class-based. It does not apply a racial equity lens. When we say school meals or even WIC, again, let's rethink the idea of just giving everyone kind of the same thing based on income. We need to be intentional about providing additional support to address structural racism, right? That's one way we address structural racism. But then the other piece is reforming everything so that, guess what? We are in the system. And I really liked what Kiana said, infiltration of existing systems. Yes, I love it. Okay, so I will go ahead and I'll stop there because y'all know that I can talk. But I hope that you all have a blessed day. It was a pleasure being on this panel. Okay, thank you so much.
And thank you all again for participating. We're going to leave the chat open till 11:30. If you have a question for a particular speaker, please direct it to that person and you all can chat back and forth. We invite you to send us thoughts about how to continue this really important conversation in future forums that we sponsor. And we look forward to seeing you in our February forum, which we'll send you details about before long. Thank you all so much, and we'll stay open.